morning to fellow South Africans, to students who are enrolling for university, to all the learners who have recently passed, and also just in general to the parents of South Africa who are deeply concerned about this issue of education. Education is a passion that I hold deeply, but something that I really believe was an instrument used in the past to oppress, and today needed to be an instrument used to liberate. No parent wakes up in the morning and hopes that their children's education is worse than theirs, let alone no parent wakes up and has a child and believes that their child's prospects must be worse than theirs. That's why I was a bit puzzled when the Deputy Minister of Basic Education said at the press conference that parents mustn't hope their children to achieve things they did not achieve. Certainly, as a child of a cashier and a father who worked in a factory, their dream for me was that I should pursue a further education, as I would hold the same dream for my children. Therefore, it becomes important that when we assess education, we don't just look at what the narrative out there is, but we really interrogate the state of education. It shall never be said that your economic circumstances or the place of your birth will determine the quality of education you get in this country. I'm joined by learners who have been through the system. I'm joined by citizens who say to themselves, surely, when we look at the context of education, yes, those who wrote this number that we put forward, 87% of them passed, as the Minister of Basic Education purports. But does that mean that of the learners who started school, today we have learners who are eligible for places of work, or today we have learners who are able to progress further? Does the education system, in fact, help or exacerbate the situation where now over 11 young people are neither in education, in employment, or in training, which is typically called NEETs? Fellow South Africans, celebrating 87% as a pass rate can never be something that we accept. Whilst I want to say more than anything that it is important that we, when we look at the issue, remember that these are young people that started studying during the time of COVID. I accept that many of them hold the certificate as a significant achievement. Our job as legislators, as leaders in society, is to say to them, what future do we want to see for these young people? And therefore, when we interrogate this figure, I think it would be fair for us to say the real pass rate is in fact 51%. And I raise this simply on the basis of the fact that of the 1.2 million learners who began schooling, only 615,000 managed to pass matric in 2024. It in fact means just over 500,000 young people have been left behind. They join the ranks of not only the unemployed, but the unemployable, when you reflect on the fact that over 90% of the people who are unemployed simply only have a qualification less than a matric. I urge and am encouraged by the fact that many of these learners will pursue alternative education paths such as TVET colleges, but the majority of them still remain lingering in townships, in communities, fulfilling really the sad dream that townships will become dormitories of unemployment. Fellow South Africans, if we want a future, let us skill our young people. We fail to skill our young people, we kill our economy. It is as straightforward as that. Our education is the foundation and the cornerstone upon which we build communities, we build our economy, and we build our future. This is fundamental, and I fear South Africa is not building a strong foundation upon which this house of education can be built on. The matric results of this year serve as a stark reminder of the urgent need to rethink and to rebuild our education system. So some key indicators that point to me some fundamental points of concern is, as I've already alluded to, the high dropout rate. That in fact of the 1.2 million learners who started grade 1 in 2013, only 51% completed matric in 2024. Furthermore, we have a low university admission rate. Just 47% of the learners achieved a bachelor's pass, which means that when you assess, the Department of Education likes to boldly say there is no such thing as a 30% pass. But the National Senior Certificate requires that a learner passes at least 3 subjects at 30%. So this idea that there's no 30% is fictitious. It is the benchmark upon which we say to our kids, you are proficient in a subject when you've achieved 31%. I jokingly always ask people to say, I'm not sure I'd enter into a plane where the pilot said I've landed 1 in 3 planes. Or to a doctor who would say to me, I only know 30% of you. And more tragically, if you create a system that passes young people at that level, you are going to end up with more and more people, more teachers coming out of the system that is broken, meaning your future teachers only aspire and have an ambition to pass people at 30%. What is true is that even when you look at this pass rate, only in fact 15% of the said learners will end up enrolling at university. I would urge, lastly, that when you look at it in context, that in fact you look at the international rankings of South Africa. South Africa now ranks 107 out of 141 in the global skills readiness, with 81% of our children unable to read for meaning by the age of 10. So we have a crisis and we need to attend to it. And Minister Sibuwe, certainly as a South African, I want to urge her to say that it can't just be that we continue business as usual. We need to reflect deeply and say, how do we reform the education system so that indeed our children will do better than us? I'm going to hand over to Nobuntu Hlazo-Webster, who will then take us to some of the interventions that we are going to be putting on the table.
Thank you very much, and good morning to the media who are present, to the young learners or the school leavers who are with us this morning, and the community at large who are here. I think our leader has spelled out the dire situation that we have with our education system. And the reality is that for us as Build One South Africa as a party, when we say that we care about making sure that this is a country where at the very least we can have a job in every home, we can't have that conversation if we don't talk about the state of education. I know for me particularly, when we talk about an economic system that gives equal opportunity to every young person in this country, we can't talk about equal opportunity when we don't have an education that actually gives an equal foundation and sets young people up for success. And so we're here particularly today because not only are we passionate about what we see, not only are we together with South Africans disturbed by the state of education, but we're ready to continue to fight this particular battle and this particular war, and the interventions which I'm going to share with you now, which we have taken, which we're taking to Parliament. But more than anything, we have a mandate from South Africans. South Africans care about the state of education, particularly when you engage with young people who have left the system and have experienced firsthand what it actually looks like, the realities, when you've been on the streets and on the ground with young people, and you hear from young people who actually cannot be employed, young people who are struggling at university level, you get to see the reality of our education system and what it actually does to our young people. We have a nationwide petition that we have sent out, and we have 20,000 signatures that we have from that petition for the abolition of the 30% pass mark in South Africa. That is a pass mark that not only sets up our young people for failure, really, but it also says that we are not giving our young people opportunity, and we're saying that we don't believe in them. We're saying we don't believe in the educators that we have to be able to set up our young people for success. And so we've gathered those 20,000 signatures, and we are electronically submitting them to the minister today to say, this is something that South Africans care about. This is the way that we start to reform the education system. We also, with our seats that we have in Parliament, are making sure that we bring this to the domain of legislation, that we bring this as a national conversation that needs to take place. And so we've written to the National Assembly Speaker, Togo Didiza, and we've requested an urgent parliamentary debate on the state of the nation. When South Africans voted in May 2024 and post the elections, they really hoped for change. They hoped that we would see something different. They hoped that the system would change, whether it's economic, whether it's education, particularly in the education system. They hoped that something would be different, and we need to take it that seriously. We need to make sure that we are debating this, and this is an opportunity for the Government of National Unity, for the Minister of Education, to actually bring real change to the education system. And so we're bringing this debate to Parliament, and we're urging the Executive and the Department of Education to bring real change to the education system so that we actually start to reform not only education but also our economy. We've also, upon the opening of schools, gone to a number of schools, spoken to parents, but we've also then set up a hotline where we have said to parents, let us know what is happening in schools. And we've actually started to receive quite a lot of complaints, quite a lot of issues of what is happening in schools, issues around resources, issues around infrastructure, sometimes even issues about the resourcing of educators in schools where there aren't enough educators. I myself was at a school last week in Ekuleni in Gauteng, and saw where there are educators and principals who are doing such a good job and doing their best, but are not being supported with the resources that they need, even as basic as water. And so we are taking those issues to the Portfolio Committee on Basic Education, where we sit, and also directly to the Minister of Education. And then lastly, we have this glowing picture that is painted every single year on the matric results, on the state of education, where we clap for 87.3% pass rate, but where the reality sees young people who are unemployed. There is a disconnect between this celebration that we have and the reality that we see. And so as Bill Dwane say, we want to get to the bottom of this disconnect. How is it that we can celebrate 87.3%, but then we have close to 70% unemployment? Of course, there are other economic factors, but a lot of these have to do with the fact that there are young people who are struggling in university. As it is, this bachelor's pass, the 47% that we speak of, only a third of those young people are adequately prepared to even engage with the curriculum at university level, at TVET colleges. And the throughput rate is low. It's at less than 12% of TVET colleges alone. And so we want to get to the bottom of that, and we're going to be asking questions in Parliament, asking what is the average mark for subjects like maths, like math literacy, like physical science, like accounting, like business economics. What is the actual average mark for those subjects? We're going to ask about the number of students who sat for IT exams in a digitally commercial world. How many of our young people are actually sitting for IT exams, and what is their performance on those exams? We want to find out what the status of the national assessments are, which the minister said would recommence. Where are we with that? And we absolutely want to know, what is the dropout rate in real numbers? When schools opened and at the announcements of the matric results, the minister spoke about how some of these young people are lost because they go on vocational paths or on technical paths, but the reality is a lot of them are simply dropping out. A lot of them are failing grades. So we want to know, what is the actual dropout mark? Let's stop creating these glowing images. Let's stop playing with these big numbers when there's a reality that really fails our young people. We will be continuing to do that in Parliament, and in other ways we'll continue to engage with South Africans, with young people and with parents to make sure that ultimately this is an education system that does deliver for our young people and that does actually make our young people competitive, not only in South Africa but globally as well. I'll hand over back to you.
About vision, and the society we want to see and live in. So these interventions are about reforming what currently sits. But in the long term, I think that we need to be bold, we need to be transformative. I'm yet to see a nation that has moved up the developmental curve without fixing its education system. There is none. And therefore, if South Africa wants to stop running a 60% social wage as its fiscal framework, it needs to be able to educate its young people. And therefore, to the future, we are saying we will fight to ensure that we no longer have young people passing at 30%. We will ensure that we introduce an establishment of an independent education ombudsman so that we can be able to better evaluate what our results are. I think educators should be paid better, particularly as educators develop their skills. We want to ensure that we introduce a school voucher program that will give parents the right to choose where their child can go to, so that you are not confined only to feeder area simply because your economic circumstances dictate that you are there. And ultimately, we need a nationwide audit for teacher skills, given the fact that we are faced up to a generational crisis of teachers aging and therefore have remained in the system, and new ones need to come on board. I really believe that if we truly believe in prioritizing foundational education phase, we need to incentivize learners, and we need to ensure that every rand of the 300 billion rands in the education budget is spent effectively. And one of the works I'll be doing going into the portfolio committee on appropriations is to look intentionally at the proper funding, particularly in the ECD sector as it pertains to BOSA, because you've got a number of learners who are coming into that system, yet there hasn't been budget allocation sufficient enough to achieve that. So you can sign an act, you can tell people who are going to do certain things, but in truth, as I look at the rands and cents of what happens in Parliament, many of the legislations that are being passed by this government are unrealizable simply on the back of financial lack of commitment to that regard. So therefore, let us use every mechanism. It's for these young people who are here that we fight. Many of them, I had an engagement with them last week. They told me about the fact that in their schools they battled with crowding. Many of them told me. They told me that now they've just gotten their results. They are still waiting for responses from universities. Many of them told me that their prospects of work are less in the country where 2 out of 3 young people do not work. I dare say, if South Africa is going to be ambitious, let us build an education of the future. Let's create skills where young people are not being prepared for an industrial era economy, but for an information age and the Internet of Things. And let's ensure that we have a future where ultimately the circumstances of your birth don't determine your education. So the fight is on, and as I close this, I want to say 3 words: educate, educate, educate. Ngiyabule, enkosi. This is not to us, but let me perhaps maybe start with your question first. The Western Cape suffers largely from a historical apartheid special planning legacy, which means that the allocation of wealth is still concentrated in certain areas, and schools follow the same pattern. What the dilemma of what that creates is that it creates a situation upon which affluent schools or quintile 5 schools are able to leverage higher school fees and pay what is typically called school governing body posts. And when you have a lot of school governing body posts, what those schools have done is increase fees against parents, increase the number of teachers that are governing body posts, and live with a limitation on the number of Western Cape Department of Education posts. So in essence, education becomes more and more expensive, more and more unaffordable, and if you live in a community where you don't have an affluent, when there isn't the wealth concentration, you find those young people are just simply further and further away. So one of the proposals I've always made is, let's take the southern suburbs we're talking about. If you are a lecturer at UCT, you should be able to apply for your child. If you're a domestic worker in the area, you should be able to apply for your child in those schools. But you stop being able to afford because those schools keep increasing their fees to be able to accommodate more SGB posts. So what in fact needs to happen is this question that becomes all resources as are allocated. The department here in the Western Cape, and I had this engagement with the MEC for Education, you need to be building better quality schools closer to learners. That's the start. The special appropriation last year was put forward to the Western Cape for the rebuilding of a number of schools, so that you can accommodate that, so that you reduce in some ways the less classroom sizes, but you also safeguard that the poorest learners are not faced up with this issue of teacher cuts. Because that's eventually where it happens. It happens there because poor communities don't always have the financial means to buy or to remunerate governing body posts. In as far as that investigation is concerned, that will be tabled in the Portfolio Committee on Basic Education. And that we will follow up on. But I can assure you, as things stand at the moment, that is why I make the statement that the circumstances of your wallet still determine what education you get in this country. As you asked me, Jason, why? I only speak to young people in their language. The more money we come across, the better education you see. No, but to the question about why this matter matters to BOSA, I reiterate again the first point I made. There's no country that can develop without a quality education. The GDP of countries like Japan and South Korea relative to South Africa's own liberation were in similar spaces, but those countries have outstripped us by a mile. And when you start to interrogate what went on, you discover they educated their citizens. So it's a responsibility of any government to educate its citizens, especially given our history. Our history told us quite intentionally that you had Bantu education, you had all sorts of discrimination, and education was a tool at its forefront. So even if we did nothing else, at least as a fundamental imperative of the last 30 years, we should have fixed our education system. That must be, at least as a freedom, as a mark of freedom, let's fix education. So even if none of the young people in the room voted for me ever, the point at the end of the day is simply this, that if we miseducate them, here are the trends. The second issue is that South Africa, in its budget of the 2.1 trillion rand it tables every year, the 60% of it is spent towards the social wage, of which the majority of the appropriation goes to the learning and culture function in the budget. So if you were running a business and you said to me, you are spending a lot of your money in education, then the question becomes, are you getting bang for buck? Thirdly, when you compare us to other countries in Africa and you use TIMS and you use other benchmarking institutions, South Africa begins to linger right down to the bottom. Were you to disaggregate poor schools and then only take the wealthier schools, quintile 4 and 5, you would discover that South Africa starts to rise up closer to the top, which tells you that in fact, the money we spend doesn't always achieve the outcomes we want it to achieve. And so it is fiscally irresponsible for us to sit back and say, we appropriate so much money, but we do nothing on education. And then lastly, it's a personal issue. Like I told you, I was raised in a home where my mother was a cashier. My father worked in a factory. My father is smarter than me but couldn't get an education. Surely it's a justice question that we must fight for going forward. So from a BOSA point of view, you can't wake up in the morning and say, we're gonna have a movement called that focuses itself on Build One South Africa, a party called Build One South Africa, and on the most divisive issue, be silent. Because It will be. It will be. You will see it. You see it for yourself. And I say this not because I don't think the department sometimes does what it needs to do. I must celebrate that in quintile 1, 2, and 3, if I look at the current education outcomes, there was some improvement. But it's still not good enough. It's still not good enough. And therefore, when we look at the issue, I would hate to live in a country where the next apartheid will be the educated and the miseducated. That's not the country we want to live in. So it is a war we must wage with everything. And then of course, yeah, you ask me the tangible, practical question whether do I think young people should vote for BOSA? I think they should, actually. Because we can debate many things, but we live in a continent where the median age is 23. The issue that affects all of these young people is education. Sometimes I worry that in this country, people express their votes on the basis sometimes of issues that are not tangential to their day-to-day reality. Education is a day-to-day reality issue. It is. Every parent wakes up with that headache. Every parent wakes up with that headache. Every child wakes up with that headache. So if the majority of your citizens are engaged with one issue, it would be irresponsible for us as a party not to speak about it, but it also, I want to urge South Africans to think hard about a future in this country, given the fact that the fundamental correction of an apartheid legacy must be a matter of educating our young people. That's why it matters.
Sure. Thank you, Leader.